Hi guys, Gabi from UiPath Hacks here. Today's video is about assets and config files. What are they and when should you use one or the other? This was one of the unclear points for me when I first started with UiPath, especially before getting acquainted with the Orchestrator. I knew assets were some kind of global variables, but I did not really understand what is the relation between variables, config files and assets, and when was it best to use each of them. Now, the official definition for assets is assets usually represent shared variables or credentials that can be used in different automation projects. Additionally, an extra level of security is provided, as all credentials stored here are encrypted with the AES 256 algorithm. So assets support the primary types. That would be text or string, boolean, integer, and credential. So if you want to save or define, for example, an object or a picture as an asset, you can't do it as a blob. You would have to save its path as a string, and something which would occur probably more often is that you would want to save maybe the contents of a list or a dictionary as an asset. And then you'd have to serialize it first in XML or JSON format, for example, or any other user-defined formats, and then deserialize it when you need to use it in your program. Serializing is basically encoding the structure into a string, and deserializing means decoding it back to a structure, to that list or dictionary, for example. Now, the maximum length of a text asset is 4,000 characters, so there should be enough space for that. If you have something longer than 4,000 characters in serialized format, you probably want to look at a flat file instead of an asset. Now, there is something called a global value switch. If it is on, it means that all the robots receive the value defined inside the assets, in this case test. If we would take it off, it means we would have to define at least one robot value or values for each of the robots we have defined on our tenant. To do that, we can add the plus sign, we search for our robots, and we type the respective value. So if we keep the global value off, we have to define, we can define separate values per robots. If we keep it on, we define centrally one value for all robots. Now, this feature is great when you want to keep some values in sync between different robots, but still provide slightly different values at the same time. For example, you might have two bots working on parallel on two different robots. So you might have two different or two processes, maybe the same process running in parallel on two different robots, and maybe they're dealing with values in different languages or different currencies or units of measure, for example, imperial versus metric. And then you might want to hold here corresponding values for the two languages or units of measure or currencies while keeping them in sync. Now, the two prerequisites that must be met in order for a robot to access an asset are: it has to have the exact name as it is defined in Orchestrator, and it has to have access to it. So this is how we define the assets. I have here two assets defined, a text one called test and a credential asset called test_credential. I have the value test_1 in the string asset, and I have in the credential one a username user_test and then a password defined for it. I would just type password here in the password field. And now going back to the studio, I've just created a new RE framework. And in the init section, because I have no items, in the init section, I have two sequences. One is to test the text asset and the other one to test the credential asset. So for the text asset, I have the get asset activity. Because we're just quickly testing the functionality, I've just hard-coded the asset name being test. So the exact name I have defined here in Orchestrator. And then I am getting its value in a string variable called str_asset value, and then I'm just displaying it. And afterwards I am updating the value of this asset with the value test2. So we have test1 right now as a value, and we should expect to have test2 after we're running this process. And for the credential test, I have the get credential activity, so it's a different one to the get asset. There are two different activities, and this one of course has the asset name as well, where I've put the test credential one, and this one gets two variables. One is a string for the username, and the other one is a secure string for the password. So I have two variables defined here. One is a secure string for the password, and the other one a normal string for the username. I am just displaying here the username, and then I'm updating the credential with a new password, just password 2. I just have it here defined in clear text, and then I'm just appending a 2 to the username. So let's run this, and then check what happened to our assets. Let's check the output first. So the asset value is test1. It's what we expected. The username is userTest. And then let's check what are the new values after the update. So if we edit this, we have test2 for the test text asset. And in the test credential, we have now test user 2 and the respective password. So it worked. This is how you can get and set values or assets, text. It's very similar for the integer or boolean ones. And this is how you can get and set credentials in UiPath. And now I think what's really interesting to discuss is how or when should we use the assets, and what alternatives do we have for assets, and when should we use those alternatives instead.
Hey guys, if you are new here, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notifications so you won't miss out on future content. Thanks!
So if you're using a framework for your use case, and you should, in I think all cases, you already have a predefined Config.xlsx file. You can see it in your project, in your data folder. That comes with the framework, and it's one of the most convenient ways to store variables for a project, especially when the information does not need to be changed between runs. Yeah, so you can define your queue, for example, and you can define any other variables here that you could use afterwards in your project. The framework is automatically reading this file, so basically there is nothing more for you to do besides just writing here your variable and the value. that you want to use in your project. You don't have to use assets for that. It's much more convenient to set some variables here in the config file. You can also define additional input data Excel files that you can maybe store somewhere else on a shared drive and have an absolute path to that. You can use those if a user needs to change some values between runs, and maybe the user who needs to do that does not have access to Orchestrator or to the VM running the bot. Maintaining such an external input data file makes it convenient for the users and removes the need to republish your project or tinker with the framework's config file on the virtual machine. Let's say that you have a use case that is downloading some report from your ERP system, and you have different codes or names for suppliers or customers that the report can be run for, and the user might want to change those customers or suppliers between the runs. Run the report for a different subset of customers or suppliers. If you maintain those values in the config file of the framework, then you might need to modify the config file on the virtual machine between runs, or even republish maybe the project if you do it from your local machine. Whereas if you maintain this kind of input data external files on a shared drive where the end user has access to, he can just change the values there and then trigger the process to run again. So this is the second option, to use some external Excel files for input data. And the third option is, of course, using assets. And this is, or the most powerful usage of assets is when you need to make bots interact with each other or share information. If you have more bots working together for the same use case, for example in dispatcher performer scenarios, maybe with multiple types of performers, and you need to share some information between the performers, assets are the easiest way to do that. Think of assets as truly global variables, global also outside of your project, potentially for all projects uploaded to your Orchestrator tenant. Other times when you need to use assets is when you want to save some information between runs after the bot shuts down. And of course, you need to do that when you are using credentials to store the password securely. So assets are a wonderful way to communicate between bots and can be a good way to maintain or to save values between subsequent runs of the same process. But in many cases, when such data does not need to be saved after a bot shuts down, you might just be better off using some variables or arguments, or just maintain that data in the config file of the framework. That was it. Hope this was useful, and see you next time. Bye. Hey, if you are getting value out of this video, could you please hit the like button? Thanks.